That I got when I was in Alaska, and there's actually a book out by Franz de Waal. He got interviewed on the Colbert Report a couple of weeks ago about your inner ape, and there's another book called Your Inner Fish. So the inner thing has been done a lot. I thought I was being clever when I came up with that, but and I had to put this one up. It's a cheap shot, but it's been on the internet for several years now. Actually, though, this is an interesting one because we'll come back to this, because Darwin actually wrote a book called On the Expression of Emotions in the Faces of Man and Animals, or something along those lines. So he actually had these sorts of things comparing the expression of fear and anger and things like that on the faces of other animals and human beings. So this kind of goes to the same idea. So I just like these pictures. This is actually one that my wife Kathy took me at the zoo recently, and these are, you know, your pensive chimps from the internet and then Rodin's thinker, just to show that the things that we think of as being uniquely human may not be as uniquely human as we think them to be. And there's a lot of reasons why evolutionary biology suggests that. So just some terms to make sure we're all on the same page. These are things that you've probably heard used in the past, sometimes used correctly, sometimes used incorrectly. The idea of Darwinian fitness just means outcompeting the other members of your species or population or whatever. Sometimes you'll hear about survival of the fittest, and that's not actually an accurate definition of what evolution is. I talked about this at the AFS meeting last June, I think it was. But basically the idea is that the individual who has more kids passes on copies of their genes which make their kids act and look like they do. So that's where fitness comes in. Selfish genes is an idea that Richard Dawkins has pushed quite a bit. He wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, and unfortunately I'm starting to hear this referred to incorrectly. His idea was just that genes used our bodies to get themselves spread to the next generation. So the genes were thinking of themselves, so the genes were selfish. Unfortunately, I'm starting to see websites now that attack evolutionary biology by saying that we have genes to be selfish, which is not what he was talking about, but unfortunately they'll use that as an attack on those ideas. So the idea there is just that the genes that make you successful want to get passed on. That's what makes a gene successful. So that's where that's coming from. And then natural selection is just the action of the environment on you to determine what's going to be beneficial. But you have to be careful with this, because a lot of people, and even biologists, will talk about natural selection as if it were a constant force. But it's more of a cost-benefit calculation, where what works depends on the cost of building the structure and the benefit you get from using it and things like that. So it's always going to be this sort of a calculation that you have to use and to try and explain any sort of behavior. So we talk about Darwin. He talked about evolutionary ideas pretty much in every book that he published, but the three main ones that relate to the stuff today: On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It's got this big Victorian British writers like these big long secondary titles. So the full title of the book is not The Origin of Species, it's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Existence, which no one ever calls it that anymore. But that was his first publication about the idea, that was published in 1859. I mentioned this a minute ago. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals was another book that he published, and then I think it was 1881, he published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. So starting out in this book, he talked about selection and what it could do and how he thought all organisms were related. Here he started trying to tie humans into other animals and how there are similarities. And here he flat out came and said that human beings came from other primates. And he specifically said that the place to look was in certain areas of Africa, which is where the Leakeys actually found some of the first fossil hominids. So he was well ahead of his time, and he raised more than a few eyebrows when he made these kinds of statements. And there's still people today, the whole "I'm not from a monkey" and things like that come up. And you can even see that this has been a problem in biology. This shows the way we used to classify the primates, including human beings. Human beings were put in their own special family and their own special genus, Homo, and there were also some extinct species in here like the Australopithecus Pithecines and things like that. But all the other great apes were put in groups separate in Pongidae. So Pan would be chimpanzees, gorilla is obviously gorilla. Pongo, I can't remember which one that is. Hylobates includes gibbons and things like that. So this may be orangutans and things of that nature. But more recent evidence says that we should break it up in a more complicated way, which puts the chimpanzees in the same family with human beings. And I put that in red because actually there's some evidence now that based on the way that we group organisms in any group that doesn't include humans, we should put chimpanzees in the genus Homo. So they should be Homo troglodytes as opposed to Pan troglodytes. That's a new idea. It's probably not going to happen because it involves humans, and people get really upset when you're saying that not only are we related to chimpanzees, but they belong in the same genus with us. But based on the way that we group other mammals, chimpanzees belong in the same genus if we're going to be consistent, which we're usually not when humans are involved. So when we talk about the other apes and humans, there's a lot of information that gets used out there, but it's not always clear. In terms of similarities, genetically, you hear a lot of numbers thrown around in terms of how similar we are between chimps. Usually these comparisons are to chimpanzees most often. And I've seen a lot of numbers, but the most recent one I could find said that genetically speaking, there's about a 99% similarity between our genes and chimpanzees' genes. Now you have to be careful with that. What this is referring to is if you take the letters of the genes in our bodies and compare the A's, the G's, and the C's, and the T's in the DNA, that about 98.7% of them will be the same letter. Now, there are many times where changes in those letters don't produce changes in the protein that comes from the DNA. So that 98.77% may not affect a lot of differences, but it still can be important. They've also looked at what are called insertions and deletions, which is big chunks of DNA that have been added or removed. And when you examine the length of the sequence, you find there's about a 4% difference in particular genes. So you average, it's about 4% difference. So this is part of the problem where you hear different numbers being used because there's lots of different ways of measuring similarity or differences. So when someone says we're 98% the same or different, you have to ask, first of all, how are they doing that? And second of all, you have to look at that difference and determine what it means, because just because you're 4% different doesn't necessarily mean a lot. In terms of behavior, there's all sorts of similarities. The aggressive behavior that we find in human beings when their territory is invaded is very similar to what you find in troops of chimpanzees, that when their territory gets invaded, they're quite likely to. They actually have found evidence of them making spears and using them on other primates for food or territory defense, so that's not uniquely human. Sexuality, you guys know about bonobos, the pygmy chimps. They're they're a separate group of chimpanzees that are very closely related to human beings. The sexuality I'm talking about here is the fact that bonobos can mate any time of year, which is extremely different from most mammals. Most mammals have a very limited time period. In the case of pandas, it's only a few days. In other mammals, it might last a few weeks or a few months. But human and bonobo sexuality that persists throughout the year is something that's pretty strange for most mammals to have, but it's not unique to us because we know of bonobos that can do the same thing. Medicine refers to the fact that chimpanzees have been found to self-medicate. There are certain plants they will eat when they're infested with certain types of parasites that either chemically drive the parasites out, or there's a type of leaf that has little hairs on it that when they swallow it, there are these types of worms that infect their digestive system that get stuck to the leaves. So the chimpanzees have learned to eat these leaves to basically scrape the parasites out of their intestinal tract. So the same basic way that we probably started with medicine, you were sick and you ate something, you felt better, we learned to put the two together. Chimpanzees have done the same thing. And that information can be transmitted from parents to offspring where they show them what to eat when they're not feeling healthy. So there's definitely that going on. Culture, information passes from adults to infants in human populations. We've obviously got a very rigidly defined system of doing that now between both interaction with your kids, but also with schools.